Okay, so before we actually go through a hypothesis testing example, I'm going to explain how to come to your decision. So the decision that you have to make is always whether to reject or not reject the null hypothesis. So whatever the original mean or average was. Um, it's not about, it's kind of like a semantic breakdown, but it's not about accepting the claim. It's about rejecting the old or not rejecting the old. Basic kind of like, yes, we can still assume the old stuff, or no, we don't. And it's one of those things where it's not a huge deal, but later in testing and research, it would come up. So, but how to know what to do, right? So you have your claim, you have your null hypothesis and your claim, your alternate, okay, whatever that may be. And so this is the null, and this is the claim. And we talked about getting a critical value. So we find the critical value. And with us here, we're going to use table F. And what that does is that sets up your critical region, okay? So if we have a greater than test, so we have our null is that our average equals some number. You don't know what, just making something up. And our claim is that our average is greater than that number, okay? So if we have a greater than test, we're going to have our critical region be on the right side of our bell curve. We find the critical value, and that's, you know, it's just, it's not a big deal where you put it, just kind of, you know, wherever. But if it's a greater than test, that means it's going to be on the right side. Okay. And so just plop that value down, whatever that may be. So critical value, we should call that CV. And then we shade the tail region. Okay. Visually, what this does is this tells us that this is the rejection region. Okay. So if we get a test score, when we do our z-score or test score, then if it falls into this region, then we would reject the null, okay? So if the test score is, in this case on the right side, if it's greater than the z-score, or the greater than critical value, then we reject. So we would do the math. You get your z-score to be some number, okay? And if that value is, in this case, more positive or to the right of our critical value, we will reject the null. So if it falls in the critical region, we reject the null. And if you can hear that singing in the background, that's my daughter in the bathroom listening to her music and singing along. So sorry about that. If we have a z-score that's not in the critical region, so if we have a test score or a z-score, I guess, that's not in the critical region, so it would be like out here, it would be less than the critical value, then this is the do not reject. And it'll make more sense once we do a few examples. So it's important to know whether you have a right side or left side situation, because positive and negatives happen, and we have to make sure we're looking at it correctly. So if we have a less than test, or a claim, that means that we'd have here our average equals some number, and then our claim is that our average is less than that number, okay? So if we have a less than test, that's on the left side. So again, we get our critical value from the table, so we look that up, and then whatever that value is, we just make it negative, because it's on the left side. Remember, here is 0, so anything to the right is going to be positive, anything to the left is negative, and we would have this be our critical region. So the number we get from the table, we slap a negative symbol on it, and we just look here at this tail area. So when we get our test score, the way I think about it is that if your test score is more negative than your critical value, then it'll be in this region. It'll be in the reject region. Okay. So if it falls in the critical region, we would reject. So this is the rejection. If we get a test score that's not more negative, it's closer to 0, then this again is the do not reject area. And again, it's about rejecting this right up here, or rejecting the claim. Back up, no. It's about rejecting the null, or not rejecting the null. That's what the decision to make is about, okay? So if we have a greater than, we have our critical value from our table. Kind of, I always draw a picture just to do a visual. That gives us our critical region. Anything greater than that critical value would be in the rejection region, so we would reject the null. If we have a less than test, then anything more negative than the critical value will be in the rejection region, so we reject the null. And you're saying, well, what about that two-tailed test you told us about? Well, same thing, right? Here, whoa, that was terrible. Okay, so if we had a two-tailed test, we look up our value in the table F, and we put it here, positive, and we put it here as negative. So there's 2 chances of rejection. So your z-score or your test score, depending on the information, it may be positive, so it might be on the side, or it may be negative, it might be on the side, but it's still the same. So anything more positive here is the rejection region. Anything more negative over here is the rejection region. Region. J's and G's making the same sound, messing me up. And all of this is the do not reject. Okay. Now, this has no numbers to it, might not make a whole bunch of sense, but that's what the next video is for. So then we're going to go through an example, or 2 or 3, and see what happens. All right. Good job.